Today, there are over 8 billion humans living on Earth. We are absolutely everywhere you look. From the buzzing streets of Tokyo and New York, home to tens of millions, to the quiet farms tucked away in remote valleys, to researchers stationed in icy polar regions, we have truly conquered this planet. We have built towering skyscrapers that touch the clouds, launched rockets that journey to Mars, and woven the intricate global web of the internet connecting us all. No other species in Earth's long history has ever dominated a planet quite like we do. But if you were to rewind the clock, if you could peer back through the mists of time to a world 900,000 years ago, the picture would be shockingly, terrifyingly different. Because back then, it wasn't modern humans who walked the Earth, but our ancient ancestors like Homo erectus and early Homo heidelbergensis. Instead of billions, there were barely 1,280 of them left alive across the entire planet. Think about that for a moment. Not 1.28 million, not 128,000, but just 1,280 breeding individuals. That's it. The entire future of humanity, our art, our science, our cities, our very existence, all of it hung by a thread so thin it's almost impossible to believe we are even here today. And here is the truly crazy part, the mind-bending twist in this incredible story. Nobody, not a single human alive, knew this happened until the year 2023. Before we go further, take a moment to like this video and tap subscribe if you haven't already. I'd also love to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment with your city and the time there. It's kind of surreal to think that people all around the world are tuning in at the same time. Scientists had long suspected that humans had gone through some kind of major population crash at some point in our distant past. The main clue was our genetic diversity, which is weirdly, unusually low compared to most other animals. For example, chimpanzees, who live in much smaller, scattered groups across Africa, possess way more genetic variation, more unique differences in their DNA than all 8 billion humans combined. That's not normal for a successful species. That's the unmistakable signature of a population bottleneck, a severe reduction in numbers. But nobody knew how truly severe it was. Nobody knew it almost ended everything before it really began. The incredible story of this discovery and our near extinction truly starts just 5 years ago, with a brilliant scientist named Wang Zhu at the Chinese Academy of Sciences. He was doing what many geneticists do, running complex genetic analyses on modern human populations to understand our evolutionary history. It was standard stuff, careful work. He was looking at DNA samples from over 3,000 people from all corners of the world, meticulously tracking mutations backward through time. Think of it like a molecular clock, ticking away through the generations, revealing our ancestral journey. Then he saw something truly weird, something utterly unexpected in his data. Around 900,000 years ago, the genetic signatures just collapsed. It was like watching a movie where suddenly, out of nowhere, 99% of the actors simply vanish from the screen, leaving almost no one behind. The mathematical models he was running, the very heart of his analysis, were screaming that something catastrophic, something beyond imagination, had happened to human ancestors. But the numbers were so extreme, so unbelievably low, that at first, Wang Zhu didn't believe them himself. He thought it had to be an error, a glitch in his complex computer analysis, a mistake in his code. Because if these calculations were right, then our human ancestors, the very blueprint of all future humanity, had been reduced to a population smaller than a typical high school, a mere handful of individuals. He spent years, not months, but years, double-checking, triple-checking, running the analysis again and again with different methods, using different computer programs, having other researchers scrutinize his work. Every single time, the result was the same. A staggering 98.7% of human ancestors were wiped out around 930,000 years ago, and the few survivors stayed at critically low, almost impossibly low, numbers for over 100,000 years. To put that in perspective, that's longer than modern humans, Homo sapiens, have even existed as a species. Now you might be thinking, okay, so our ancestors went through a tough time. Big deal. Species bounce back from near extinction all the time, right? Wrong. When populations get this incredibly small, they don't usually bounce back. They die out. Mathematical models developed by biologists show that once a species is down to around 1,000 individuals, it enters what scientists grimly call the extinction vortex. It's a terrifying spiral where genetic problems pile up, inbreeding increases, leading to more birth defects and reduced fertility. Beneficial mutations are lost, and random disasters like a single disease outbreak or a localized drought can easily wipe out the entire tiny group. Most species that hit numbers this low just vanish forever from the face of the earth. But somehow, our ancestors didn't vanish. For 117,000 years, they held on. Through multiple brutal ice ages, through prolonged, devastating droughts, through the extinction of countless other species, a tiny, fragile population of early humans, spread across who knows where in Africa, kept the flickering flame of humanity alive when every scientific principle suggested it should have been snuffed out completely. What makes this discovery even more incredible, even more astounding, is the timing. That period, 900,000 years ago, puts us right in the middle of what geologists call the early Middle Pleistocene transition. This was a time when Earth's climate went completely, spectacularly insane. Before this period, ice ages, though tough, came and went in relatively predictable 41,000-year cycles. The planet would get cold, vast ice sheets would grow, then things would warm up again and life would adapt. It was manageable. But around 900,000 years ago, everything fundamentally changed. The Ice Age cycles shifted to brutal, much longer, 100,000-year patterns. Glaciers became absolutely massive, growing to cover huge chunks of the northern continents, like a vast white shroud. Sea levels plummeted by hundreds of feet, dramatically reshaping coastlines and exposing new land. Ocean temperatures plummeted to terrifying lows. And in Africa, the very continent where our ancestors lived and struggled, the climate became incredibly harsh, relentlessly dry, and utterly unforgiving. Picture this if you can. You are an early human, perhaps a member of Homo erectus or one of their immediate descendants, living in what used to be a lush, bountiful woodland. Over generations, over the span of many human lifetimes, your entire world is slowly but brutally transforming into an arid wasteland. The vital water sources you and your ancestors relied upon are disappearing, one by one, stream by stream, river by river. The animals you hunt for food, the very heart of your diet, are going extinct, their numbers dwindling until they are gone entirely. Plant foods, roots, berries, leaves, everything edible is becoming scarce, harder to find, less nutritious. And it isn't getting better. It's getting worse relentlessly for thousands and thousands of years. This is what scientists call a perfect storm for mass extinction. And that's exactly what happened to most human populations across the vast African continent. They were simply wiped out. Whole groups, whole lineages, whole ways of life vanished without a trace. Only a tiny, isolated group, somewhere in Africa, managed to survive. We don't know where exactly they lived, what specific valley or refuge sheltered them. We don't know precisely how they managed it, what secret knowledge or extraordinary luck protected them. But they did. Now, here, that's where the story gets even more mind-bending, even more deeply connected to who we are today. During this bottleneck period, something utterly unprecedented happened to human genetics. Two of our ancestral chromosomes, separate pieces of our genetic code, fused together. They just merged into one. This is why modern humans have 46 chromosomes, while our closest living relatives, chimpanzees and gorillas, have 48. Chromosome fusion is an incredibly rare event in evolutionary history. It happens maybe once in millions of years of evolution, a true genetic anomaly, and it happened right in the middle of our near-extinction event. This wasn't a coincidence. See, when populations are very, very small, unusual genetic changes, even rare ones, can spread through the entire group much faster than they normally would. If just one individual had this chromosome fusion, and that individual survived to reproduce, their children would carry it. And in a tiny population of only 1,280 people, a unique genetic change like this could become universal, meaning every single member of the group would possess it within just a few generations. Today, every single human on Earth, without exception, carries this fused chromosome. All 8 billion of us. It is our chromosome too, and it contains the indelible genetic signature of those desperate, harrowing 117,000 years when humanity nearly died out completely. Scientists can actually point to the exact spot on that chromosome where the fusion happened. They can see the molecular scars, the precise chemical marks, where two ancient chromosomes joined together. It's like forensic evidence from the most important, most dramatic crime scene in human history, etched into our very being. But the chromosome fusion did more than just reduce our chromosome count. Some researchers believe it may have actually triggered crucial changes in brain development. Genes near that fusion site affect neural function, the way our brains are built and work. It's possible that the intense genetic shake-up, the evolutionary pressure cooker during the bottleneck, contributed directly to the evolution of larger, more complex human brains. Think about that for a moment. Our intelligence, our astonishing ability to create magnificent art and beautiful music and groundbreaking technology, our unique capacity for intricate language and abstract thought, all of it might trace back to a genetic accident that happened when there were barely 1,000 humans left on Earth, clinging to survival. The overwhelming evidence for this bottleneck, this lost chapter of our past, is written in our DNA like a time capsule waiting to be opened. Every person alive today carries the molecular signature of those 117,000 years of survival. Population geneticists can see it in the intricate patterns of genetic variation, the mathematical fingerprint of near extinction that marks our species. But for decades, nobody could interpret this signal correctly. See, older genetic analysis methods were like trying to read a massive book through a tiny keyhole. Scientists could detect that something had happened in our past, some kind of population upheaval, but they couldn't see the full, terrifying picture. They knew humans had been through at least one major population bottleneck, probably when our ancestors left Africa around 60,000 years ago, leading to the founder effect in non-African populations. But they had no idea, absolutely no clue, that there was an earlier, much more severe one that dwarfed all others. It took the development of revolutionary new computational tools, like the Fit-Cole method that Wang Zhu and his dedicated team created, to finally crack the code. These new techniques can analyze thousands of human genomes simultaneously and trace genetic changes back nearly 1 million years with astonishing accuracy. When Wang Zhu first published his groundbreaking findings in the prestigious journal Science in 2023, the scientific community was stunned, shocked to its core. Not just because of how unbelievably severe the bottleneck was, but because of how incredibly long it lasted. Most population bottlenecks in evolutionary history are relatively short. A volcanic eruption might wipe out most of a species, but then the survivors rapidly multiply to fill the empty ecological niche. Or a sudden disease might kill off 90% of a population, but the remaining 10% recover within a few generations. But 117,000 years. That's not just a bottleneck. That's more like an extended near-death experience for an entire species, a prolonged fight for life against impossible odds. Nick Ashton, a respected archaeologist at the British Museum who reviewed the study, put it best. This would imply that the surviving population occupied a very localized area with good social cohesion for it to survive. Of greater surprise is the estimated length of time that this small group survived. If this is correct, then one imagines that it would require a stable environment with sufficient resources and few stresses to the system. In other words, somewhere in Africa, there had to be a pocket of stability, a secret refuge, where a tiny group of early humans found everything they needed to survive while the rest of the continent, the entire world outside their haven, was being ravaged by catastrophic climate change. But where was this refuge? What made it so special, so resilient? How did a mere 1,280 people manage to maintain a stable, viable population for over 100,000 years against such incredible odds? These are the profound questions that continue to keep scientists up at night, driving their research. Some researchers now think the survivors lived near incredibly reliable water sources, perhaps around the Great Lakes of East Africa, or along major rivers that kept flowing even when the climate turned desperately harsh. Water means animals come to drink. Animals mean food for hunting. And both water and food in those desperate times meant the difference between life and death. Others believe the survivors had developed crucial, life-saving technologies that other human populations, those that ultimately vanished, lacked. Maybe they had figured out how to control fire more effectively, not just use it, but truly master it. Fire changes everything for early humans. It lets you cook food, which makes more nutrients available from the same amount of effort. It keeps dangerous predators away at night. It extends the day, giving you more precious time to work on tools, repair shelters, and socialize. Most importantly, it lets you survive in environments that would otherwise kill you outright. Archaeological evidence, though sparse from this period, shows that around 800,000 years ago, there was a sudden, noticeable increase in the systematic use of fire by human populations. This timing matches almost perfectly with when the genetic bottleneck finally ended and human populations began to expand again. Coincidence? Probably not. It suggests a critical technological leap that provided a survival advantage. But here's the thing that really blows your mind, the truly unsettling aspect of this period. The fossil record from this bottleneck period is almost completely empty. Between 950,000 and 650,000 years ago, there are hardly any human fossils found anywhere in Africa or Europe. For a very long time, anthropologists called this the fossil gap and simply couldn't explain it. Now, with Wang Zhu's discovery, we know precisely why. There simply weren't many humans around to leave fossils behind. With only 1,280 breeding individuals, scattered across who knows how much territory, the chances of any of them dying in the perfect conditions that would preserve their delicate bones for hundreds of thousands of years were incredibly, astronomically small. It's like trying to find a needle in a haystack, except there are barely any needles, and the haystack is the size of an entire continent. The few fossils we do have from this period are mostly from Europe and Asia, not Africa. This means they probably represent human populations that weren't directly part of the ancestral bottleneck. Perhaps the severe population crash only affected certain groups of early humans in Africa, while others in different regions managed to survive in slightly larger numbers for a time. This makes perfect sense when you think about it. Africa is a huge, incredibly diverse continent with vastly different climates and ecosystems. While some regions might have become utterly uninhabitable during the climate crisis, others might have remained relatively stable. But the genetic evidence, the story written in our DNA, is clear. The ancestors of all modern humans, plus Neanderthals and Denisovans, went through this extreme bottleneck. We are all, every single one of us, direct descendants of those 1,280 survivors. Every single person reading this story, every person on Earth, carries DNA from that tiny, resilient population that refused to give up during the worst climate crisis in human evolutionary history. Scientists estimate that we lost about 65% of our total genetic diversity during the bottleneck. That's an enormous, almost unimaginable amount of variation gone forever. For comparison, the famous founder effect, when modern humans left Africa around 60,000 years ago, only reduced genetic diversity by about 15%. This immense loss of genetic diversity has consequences we are still living with today. It's why humans, as a species, are unusually susceptible to certain diseases. It's why we have relatively weak immune systems compared to other primates. It's why genetic disorders that would be incredibly rare in more diverse populations are relatively common in humans. In a strange, twisted way, our genetic weaknesses are actually proof of our greatest triumph. Every genetic vulnerability we carry is silent, molecular evidence that our ancestors were tough enough, resilient enough, to survive when survival seemed utterly impossible. But the story doesn't end with mere survival. The most incredible part, the most hopeful twist, is what happened next. Around 813,000 years ago, something subtle yet profound changed. The population of early humans, that tiny remnant, began to grow again. Not slowly, not gradually, but rapidly, explosively. Within just a few thousand years, which is a blink of an eye in evolutionary terms, the descendants of those 1,280 survivors had spread across Africa and even begun expanding beyond its borders. They developed new technologies, more sophisticated tools, better ways to hunt and gather. They began to hunt larger animals more effectively, using coordinated tactics and improved weaponry. They started building more permanent shelters and controlling fire more systematically, using it as a central part of their daily lives. Most importantly, they began the profound evolutionary journey that would eventually lead to three of the most successful human species in history: modern humans, Homo sapiens, the robust Neanderthals, and the mysterious Denisovans. The timing is too perfect to be coincidental. The genetic evidence suggests that the last common ancestor of all three species lived right around the time the bottleneck ended, right when the climate began to improve and populations began to expand. It's as if the near-extinction event didn't just test our ancestors' survival skills. It forged them, hardened them, refined them into something new, something stronger, something more adaptable, something that could not just survive in a hostile world, but eventually dominate it completely. Ye Pan, one of the brilliant scientists who discovered the bottleneck, put it this way: the novel finding opens a new field in human evolution because it evokes many questions, such as the places where these individuals lived, how they overcame the catastrophic climate changes, and whether natural selection during the bottleneck has accelerated the evolution of human brain. That last part, natural selection during the bottleneck, is absolutely crucial. When population sizes are extremely small, evolution doesn't work the way it normally does in large, sprawling populations. Usually, genetic changes, new mutations, spread slowly through large populations. Beneficial mutations can take hundreds of generations to become common. Harmful ones take time to disappear. But in a tiny population of 1,280 individuals, evolution moves at lightning speed. Beneficial traits, even small ones, can spread through the entire group within just a few generations. Individuals with even a slight advantage in survival or reproduction, perhaps better eyesight, or a stronger immune system, or a more cooperative disposition, can quickly dominate the gene pool. For 117,000 years, our ancestors were basically living in an evolutionary pressure cooker, a constant, brutal test of fitness. Only the smartest, the toughest, the most adaptable individuals survived to pass on their precious genes. Generation after generation after generation of intense natural selection, picking out and amplifying exactly the traits that would later make humans so incredibly successful. Problem-solving ability, social cooperation, advanced tool use, sophisticated communication skills, the capacity to learn and adapt quickly to constantly changing environments. All of these crucial traits were probably being refined and amplified, sharpened to a razor's edge, during those 117,000 years of near extinction. The genetic bottleneck wasn't just something our ancestors survived. It was something that fundamentally made them, and by extension us, who we are. But what did that actually look like? What was it truly like, living through 117,000 years of evolutionary hell on the very precipice of extinction? Let's go back, way back. It's 930,000 years ago, and for your small band, the world is ending. Not in some dramatic explosion or a sudden asteroid impact, but slowly, brutally, agonizingly, one failed hunt, one dried-up water hole, one starving child at a time. You are part of a small band of early humans, maybe 30 or 40 individuals, an extended family unit. Your species doesn't even have a widely agreed-upon name yet. Are you Homo erectus? Homo heidelbergensis? Scientists still argue about the precise details of classification. What truly matters is that you are human enough that your children's children's children, thousands of generations later, will eventually become us, modern humans. And right now, you are watching your world disappear, unraveling before your eyes. The familiar forests where your parents and grandparents hunted, where your ancestors lived for millennia, are slowly but relentlessly turning into scrubland. The scrubland is then transforming into barren desert. Rivers that ran year-round, reliable arteries of life, are now seasonal streams, then just dry beds marked with cracked, sun-baked mud. Your band moves constantly, a nomadic existence, following water sources that keep drying up, following dwindling herds of animals that keep getting smaller and harder to find, following a fragile thread of hope that keeps getting dimmer with each passing year. This isn't just a drought. Droughts end. This is the new, terrifying normal. The Earth's orbital patterns have shifted into a nightmare configuration, triggering these long, brutal ice ages. Ice sheets in the north are growing massive, locking up so much water that sea levels drop by hundreds of feet, exposing vast new coastlines. The Mediterranean Sea becomes a series of smaller, isolated lakes. Land bridges appear between continents, briefly connecting previously separate lands. But it's not the ice itself that's killing your people directly. It's what the ice does to Africa. See, when huge ice sheets form in the north, they create a kind of atmospheric dam, fundamentally altering global weather patterns. The monsoons that used to bring regular, life-giving rains to Africa get disrupted, becoming weak and erratic, sometimes failing entirely for years on end. What used to be lush woodland becomes dry grassland. Grassland becomes sparse desert, and desert becomes nothing at all, a barren, lifeless expanse. Scientists have a name for what happened to Africa during this period: aridification. The continent didn't just get drier, it got catastrophically, unimaginably drier. Fossil evidence from this time shows that most of the large mammals, the megafauna that had thrived for millions of years, went extinct. Antelope species that had roamed in vast herds just vanished. Elephant populations crashed dramatically. When the big animals, the primary food source, die out, everything else follows. Predators starve, scavengers starve, and anything that depended on hunting or scavenging like early humans faces a stark, brutal choice: adapt or die. Most chose poorly. Most died out, their lineages ending forever. But your small band, your unique group, one of a handful of such groups making up the 1,280 breeding individuals scattered across the continent, you found something the others missed. Maybe it was a specific mountain range that still caught enough rainfall to support a few resilient trees and some small game. Maybe it was an underground aquifer, a hidden reservoir of water that kept crucial springs flowing when everything else dried up. Maybe it was a unique rift valley that created its own microclimate, a small pocket of relative stability. Whatever it was, it worked, providing just enough for survival for 117,000 years. Now let's talk about what working actually meant. Forget everything you think you know about human evolution being a steady, upward march toward progress. There was no progress during the bottleneck. There was only survival, raw, brutal, desperate survival. Your band probably lived in small groups of 20 to 30 people, extended families where everyone was related to everyone else within a few generations. You had to be, with only 1,280 breeding individuals total on the entire planet, you couldn't afford to be picky about who you partnered with. Inbreeding was inevitable. Genetic disorders were probably common: birth defects, developmental problems, reduced fertility, all the devastating consequences of a gene pool that's far too small, far too limited. But somehow, impossibly, you persisted. The daily routine was brutal, relentless, utterly unforgiving. Wake up, find water, find food, don't get killed. Repeat. Repeat for 117,000 years. Water came first always, every single day. In a landscape where most streams ran dry for half the year, knowing precisely where to find reliable, hidden water sources meant the absolute difference between life and death. Your people probably developed an almost supernatural ability to read the land, to spot the most subtle signs of underground water, to predict which seasonal streams would flow longest and which would dry up first. You might have learned to dig wells, simple ones, maybe just holes scraped out with sticks and stones and bare hands. But even a crude well that reached groundwater could sustain a family, a small group, through a long, agonizing dry season. Food was even harder to come by. With most of the large game animals extinct or drastically reduced, you couldn't rely on hunting the way your ancestors had for millions of years. You became what anthropologists call dietary generalists. You ate everything. Insects, always insects. Termites, crickets, beetle larvae. Pound for pound, insects are some of the most nutritious, protein-rich food sources on the planet, and they reproduce quickly, so even small populations could be harvested sustainably. You ate roots, tubers, anything that grew underground where it was protected from the scorching heat and the crushing drought. You learned which plants were edible during different seasons, which ones were toxic unless prepared properly, which ones could be stored for lean times, carefully processed and preserved. You became an expert at finding eggs, bird eggs, reptile eggs, anything with precious protein. You probably learned to follow certain animals to their nesting grounds, timing your raids for maximum yield without destroying future breeding populations. And occasionally, when you got incredibly lucky, you found meat. Not the massive woolly mammoths or giant bison your ancestors hunted in groups of dozens. Those magnificent creatures were long gone from your region. But smaller animals, a young antelope separated from its herd, an injured zebra, an old elephant dying of thirst, a chance discovery that would feed the band for days. This is where fire became not just useful but absolutely crucial for survival. Early humans had been using fire for hundreds of thousands of years, mastering its control. But during the bottleneck, fire wasn't just useful, it was the definitive difference between life and death. Cooking meat made it safer to eat, killing parasites and bacteria that could wipe out your entire family. More importantly, cooking broke down tough proteins and made nutrients more available, meaning you could extract more calories, more energy, from the same amount of food. Cooking plants was even more revolutionary. Many roots and tubers are indigestible or even poisonous when raw, but cook them, and they become major sources of carbohydrates, essential energy. Some researchers now think this is precisely when humans first learned to process plant foods systematically, transforming them into a reliable and safe food source. But fire did more than just improve your diet. It extended your day. Without artificial light, most animals are helpless after dark. Predators hunt, prey, hide. Everyone's basically shut down until sunrise. But with fire, your band could stay active after sunset. You could work on tools, repair shelters, share vital information about where you found water or food that day. Most importantly, you could strengthen social bonds. And social bonds were everything during the bottleneck. With groups this small, you couldn't afford conflict, you couldn't afford disharmony. Every single individual was precious, irreplaceable. Lose one adult to fighting or accidents or disease, and the whole band was weakened. Its chances of survival diminished. Lose several and you might not survive the next bad season at all. So you developed cooperation skills that would make modern diplomats jealous. You learned to share resources, even when resources were desperately scarce. You learned to resolve disputes without violence, to mediate and compromise. You learned to care for the sick and injured instead of abandoning them to their fate. Most crucially, you learn to share knowledge, to transmit it effectively. When one person discovered a new, reliable water source, everyone learned about it. When someone figured out how to process a toxic plant to make it edible and nutritious, that knowledge spread through the group immediately, becoming collective wisdom. When hunters developed a new, more effective technique for tracking game, it became common knowledge within days, taught to the younger generation. This wasn't just being nice. It was a fundamental, non-negotiable survival strategy. In a population this small, losing accumulated knowledge when someone died could be catastrophic, meaning the difference between living and dying for everyone else. So, you developed powerful oral traditions, elaborate teaching methods, and reliable ways of passing crucial information from one generation to the next. You became obsessive about teaching children not just basic survival skills, but everything. Where to find water in each season, which plants were safe, how to read animal tracks, how to predict weather patterns, how to make and maintain complex tools. Children who learned quickly, who absorbed and retained this vital information, had better chances of survival. Children who learned quickly had better chances of reproduction, passing on their quick learning genes. Over thousands of generations, you were unknowingly selecting for intelligence, for teaching ability, for the capacity to acquire and transmit complex information effectively. You were evolving into something new, something unprecedented. The genetic evidence suggests that during the bottleneck, human brain size began to increase, not dramatically all at once. That would come later, but measurably. The cranial capacity, the space for the brain, in human fossils from just after the bottleneck period is noticeably larger than those from before. This makes perfect evolutionary sense. When survival depends entirely on outsmarting your harsh environment, natural selection powerfully favors bigger, more capable brains, even if bigger brains require more energy that was desperately scarce during the crisis. But it wasn't just raw intelligence that was evolving. It was specifically social intelligence. Living in tiny, interlinked groups for thousands of generations, you became incredibly skilled at reading other people, at predicting their behavior, at knowing when to trust, when to be cautious, when to share, when to withhold. You developed what psychologists call theory of mind, the profound ability to understand that other people have thoughts and intentions different from your own, to empathize and anticipate. This sounds simple, but it's actually one of the most complex cognitive abilities in the entire animal kingdom, and you were refining it under the most intense survival pressure imaginable. The archaeological record from this period is frustratingly sparse, a tantalizing puzzle, but what little we have is fascinating. Tools become more sophisticated, but also more standardized, as if small groups were developing consistent, effective ways of making things, and sharing those techniques widely across their networks. Stone tools from the late bottleneck period show what archaeologists call cultural convergence, remarkably similar designs appearing in different regions at roughly the same time. This suggests communication networks between groups, rudimentary trade routes, maybe even regular gatherings where distant bands would meet to exchange not just goods, but crucial knowledge and, vitally, genes, refreshing their dangerously small gene pools. Because here's the thing about those 1,280 breeding individuals. They weren't all living in one single place. Basic population genetics tells us they had to be spread out, separated. Put 1,280 people in one valley and a single disaster, a devastating flood, an unrelenting drought, a sudden disease outbreak, a localized volcanic eruption, could wipe them all out. Evolution doesn't make that kind of mistake. So they were scattered, dispersed. Maybe groups of 20 or 30 people, separated by hundreds of miles, connected by intricate networks of kinship and trade, but living independently enough that no single catastrophe could destroy them all. This created what biologists call a metapopulation structure. Individual groups rising and falling, some going extinct, some struggling to survive, but the overall network surviving, enduring. It's like a desperate game of whack-a-mole, except the moles are human populations and the hammers are droughts, diseases, and climate disasters. Some groups get hit and disappear, their lineage ending, but others survive, reproduce, and send out migrants to repopulate the empty territories, keeping the whole system alive. For 117,000 years, this desperate, brutal game continued. Some generations probably lived relatively well, finding good territories with reliable resources, periods of mild climate. Others suffered terribly, watching children die of starvation and disease, facing the raw brutality of nature. But somehow the network held. And then, around 813,000 years ago, something truly changed. The first signs were subtle, almost imperceptible. Slightly more reliable rainfall in some regions. Grasslands beginning to expand again after millennia of desertification. Animal populations, slowly, tentatively, starting to recover. The most extreme, brutal phase of the climate crisis was finally ending. But by this time, your people, the descendants of those 1,280 survivors, weren't the same species that had entered the bottleneck. 117,000 years of intense natural selection, of relentless pressure, had transformed them, made them smarter, more cooperative, better adapted to survive in harsh, unpredictable environments. They had developed technologies that would have seemed like magic to their distant ancestors. Better tools, more sophisticated fire management, improved food processing techniques. Most importantly, they had developed incredibly robust social systems capable of maintaining cooperation and knowledge sharing across multiple generations, across vast distances. When the climate began to improve, they were ready. Population growth was explosive. Within a few thousand years, a mere blink in geological time, the descendants of the bottleneck survivors had spread across Africa and begun expanding into Europe and Asia. They carried with them all the survival skills learned during the crisis, plus the genetic and cultural adaptations that had kept them alive when death seemed certain for all other human groups. These weren't just any humans. These were humans who had been forged, hammered, and refined by the worst environmental crisis in our species' history. They were the ancestors of every human who would come after. Every person alive today carries genes that survived 117,000 years of near extinction. Genes selected for intelligence, cooperation, and adaptability under the most extreme, unimaginable conditions. We are all descendants of the survivors, all products of the bottleneck. All living evidence that sometimes, against all odds, life finds a way. But the story was just beginning. What happened next changed everything, not just for humanity, but for the entire planet. Picture this. Your ancestors have just survived the worst climate disaster in human history, an event that wiped out most other early human populations, leaving only a tiny remnant. For over 100,000 years, they've been living on the very edge of extinction, tiny groups scattered across Africa, clinging to whatever refuges they could find, their existence a daily struggle for survival. Then, miraculously, the rains return. Not all at once, not everywhere, but slowly, tentatively, year by year, the grasslands start coming back. Rivers that had been dry for millennia begin to flow again, carving new paths through the landscape. Animals that had vanished from vast regions start reappearing in small herds, reclaiming their ancient territories. And your people, your battle-hardened, climate-tested, evolutionarily refined people, they exploded across the landscape like nothing the world had ever seen. Within just a few thousand years, which is barely a heartbeat in evolutionary terms, the descendants of those 1,280 survivors had multiplied into hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions. They spread from whatever corner of Africa had sheltered them during the crisis, and began colonizing vast territories that had been empty of humans for ages. But that's where the story gets really wild, where the plot thickens considerably. They weren't just expanding as one big, happy, unified human family. The genetic bottleneck had done something unprecedented to human evolution. It had inadvertently set the stage for the most important speciation event in our entire lineage. Around 800,000 years ago, that single, now expanding, population of survivors began splitting into three distinct groups, three separate evolutionary paths that would eventually become the three most successful human species in history. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, the robust Neanderthals, and the mysterious Denisovans. Now, speciation, the process by which one species splits into two or more distinct species, usually takes hundreds of thousands of years, maybe even millions. Species diverge slowly, accumulating genetic and physical differences generation by generation, until they can no longer interbreed successfully. But the bottleneck compressed and accelerated everything. Those 117,000 years of intense natural selection had created a kind of evolutionary spring loading. When the population finally expanded, it exploded in multiple directions at once, diversifying rapidly. Think of it like this. You take a mighty river and force all its immense volume through the narrowest possible channel for 100,000 years. All that water pressure builds up, an unstoppable force. Then suddenly, you remove the constraint, open the dam. The water doesn't just flow gently. It erupts in every direction, carving new channels, creating new pathways, transforming the landscape. That's what happened to human evolution after the bottleneck. The first group, a large and diverse population, stayed in Africa. These would eventually become the ancestors of modern humans, Homo sapiens, but they weren't modern yet. They were still evolving, still refining the survival skills that had carried them through the crisis, still adapting to Africa's unique challenges. The second group, a smaller but powerful contingent, moved north and west, migrating into Europe and Western Asia. These populations found a very different world than the one their ancestors had known in Africa. Colder, more seasonal, full of new challenges and new opportunities. They adapted incredibly fast. Within a few 100,000 years, they had developed the robust builds, enlarged nasal passages, and cold weather adaptations that would make them perfectly suited to the harsh, often icy, climates of Ice Age Europe. They became the Neanderthals. The third group went east, spreading across Asia and eventually reaching as far as Indonesia and New Guinea. We know less about them because they left fewer fossils, making their archaeological record much patchier. But we know they existed because their unique DNA still shows up in modern populations across Asia and Oceania. They were the Denisovans. All three groups carried the unmistakable genetic signature of the bottleneck: the fused chromosome, the reduced genetic diversity compared to other primates, the neural adaptations that had been so powerfully selected for during those brutal 117,000 years of struggle. But they also began developing their own unique traits, specializing for their specific environments. The African population that stayed behind faced a recovering but still challenging environment. They needed to be highly adaptable, incredibly innovative, capable of exploiting a wide range of resources in a continent that remained ecologically diverse and often unpredictable. As the climate continued to fluctuate, natural selection favored intelligence, problem-solving ability, and the capacity to develop new technologies quickly when conditions changed. Over hundreds of thousands of years, this population developed what we now recognize as the key features of modern humans: larger brains relative to body size, a more graceful, less robust bone structure, and an enhanced capacity for symbolic thinking, for abstract thought and creativity. Most importantly, they developed what anthropologists call behavioral modernity, the profound ability to create art, use complex symbols, engage in abstract reasoning, and plan for the distant future. This was the mental toolkit that would eventually let them dominate the planet. But that was still far in the future. For now, they were just one of three distinct human species, all competing for resources in a world that was still recovering from the greatest climate disaster in human history. The Neanderthals, meanwhile, were becoming something else entirely, adapting to a different set of challenges. Moving into Europe during the recovery period, they encountered environments that were still brutally cold and highly seasonal. Winters that could last 8 months, summers that were brief and often unpredictable. They adapted by becoming incredibly robust, physically powerful. Neanderthal skeletons show bone density and muscle mass that would make modern bodybuilders green with envy. They developed massive nasal passages to warm and humidify the cold, dry air they breathed, a physical adaptation to their environment. Their brains actually grew larger, on average, than those of modern humans, possibly as an adaptation to the complex challenges of Ice Age survival, requiring immense spatial memory and problem-solving skills in a difficult landscape. But their most impressive adaptation was cultural. Neanderthals became master hunters, not just opportunistic scavengers like many of their predecessors, but systematic, strategic predators capable of taking down massive Ice Age mammals like mammoths and woolly rhinos. They developed sophisticated spear-throwing techniques, perhaps using short, thrusting spears rather than long, throwing spears. They learned to hunt in coordinated groups, driving large animals into kill zones, a testament to their cooperation. They figured out how to preserve meat through long, harsh winters, probably using natural refrigeration in caves and permafrost. Most remarkably, they developed the first systematic burial practices in human history. Neanderthal graves show clear evidence of intentional placement of the body, sometimes with grave goods like flowers or tools. This suggests they had developed symbolic thinking, the ability to conceive of death as something meaningful, something worthy of ritual, something beyond simple biological cessation. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were creating culture, thinking abstractly about life and death. The Denisovans were doing something similar in Asia, carving out their own unique niche. But we know much less about their specific adaptations because their fossil record is even more elusive. What we do know is that they were incredibly successful. Genetic analysis of modern Asian populations shows Denisovan DNA from the Philippines to Tibet, indicating they spread across an enormous range of diverse environments, from tropical islands to high-altitude mountains. Some Denisovan populations adapted to high altitudes, developing genetic variants that helped them process oxygen more efficiently in the thin air of the Himalayan plateau. These same genetic variants show up in modern Tibetan populations today, powerful evidence that ancient humans and Denisovans interbred, passing on crucial survival genes that are still helping people live at extreme altitudes. Other Denisovan groups seem to have been skilled seafarers. There's tantalizing evidence they reached islands in Southeast Asia that would have required sophisticated boat building and navigation skills, suggesting they developed maritime technologies thousands of years before any other human species. But here's what's really incredible, what connects all three groups so profoundly. They were still connected. Despite spreading across 3 continents and adapting to radically different environments, they remained genetically close enough to interbreed when their ranges overlapped. Modern humans and Neanderthals interbred when our ancestors finally left Africa around 60,000 years ago. Denisovans interbred with both Neanderthals and modern humans at various times and places across Asia. The genetic evidence shows multiple episodes of interbreeding over hundreds of thousands of years. This tells us something profound about the bottleneck and its aftermath. Those 117,000 years of near extinction had created a kind of deep genetic unity among all human populations. Despite evolving along different paths for hundreds of thousands of years, we were all still fundamentally the same species, capable of producing fertile offspring, all still carrying the chromosomal fusion that marked us as bottleneck survivors, all still sharing the basic genetic toolkit that had been refined during those desperate millennia. But each group was also developing its own specialized survival strategies. The archaeological record from this period shows an explosion of technological innovation, not just among one group, but among all three. In Africa, stone tool technology becomes increasingly sophisticated. The simple choppers and hand axes that had dominated human tool kits for millions of years give way to carefully crafted spear points, scrapers, and cutting implements designed for specific tasks. More importantly, tool making became standardized, refined. Archaeological sites from across Africa show remarkably similar tool designs, suggesting widespread communication and knowledge sharing between groups. This is the signature of true cultural evolution, ideas spreading faster than genes, allowing rapid adaptation to new challenges and opportunities. In Europe, Neanderthals were developing their own distinct technological traditions. They created the first hafted tools, spear points and knives attached to wooden handles with plant resins and animal sinews. This might sound simple, but it represents a major cognitive leap. You have to plan ahead, gather multiple materials, and understand abstract concepts like torque and leverage. They also developed what archaeologists call prepared core techniques for stone tool making. Instead of just chipping away at rocks until they got something useful, Neanderthals learned to carefully shape stone cores so they could produce multiple identical tools from a single piece of raw material. This is manufacturing, planned, systematic production of standardized goods. The Denisovans were innovating too, though their achievements are harder to trace due to the scarcity of fossils. But genetic analysis suggests they were the first human species to develop systematic use of plant medicines. Modern Asian populations carry Denisovan gene variants that help process plant toxins, suggesting their ancestors had learned to use poisonous plants as medicines, developing resistance through natural selection. They might also have been the first humans to practice systematic agriculture, a truly revolutionary idea. Some researchers think the genetic variants that help digest starchy foods in modern Asian populations originated with Denisovans who had learned to cultivate and process wild grains, an early form of farming. But perhaps the most important innovation, the one that truly set the stage for our eventual dominance, was happening in the realm of social organization. All three post-bottleneck human species were developing increasingly complex social structures. Extended family groups were forming alliances with other groups, creating broader networks of cooperation. Trade networks were emerging that could move raw materials and finished goods across hundreds of miles, a testament to intergroup relationships. This wasn't just survival anymore. This was the beginning of civilization, the foundational building blocks of complex societies. The genetic evidence for this social revolution is written in our DNA. During the post-bottleneck expansion, human populations show evidence of what geneticists call structured breeding patterns. Not random mating, but systematic exchange of marriage partners between groups. This suggests our ancestors had developed kinship systems, complex rules about who could marry whom, probably elaborate gift exchange networks that maintained crucial relationships between distant communities, ensuring genetic diversity and social cohesion. They were creating the social glue that would eventually allow human societies to scale up from small bands to tribes, chiefdoms, and eventually states and empires. But they were also creating something else, something that would prove even more important in the long run: language. Now, nobody knows exactly when human language in its full complexity evolved. It doesn't fossilize. We can only infer its development from indirect evidence. But everything, all the clues, points to the post-bottleneck period as the time when human communication became truly sophisticated, reaching levels of complexity never before seen. The rapid spread of standardized tool technologies suggests complex information transfer, a necessity for teaching intricate skills. The evidence of trade networks implies negotiation and abstract reasoning, things that require language. The burial practices of Neanderthals indicate symbolic thinking, a prerequisite for language. Most tellingly, the genetic bottleneck had created exactly the conditions under which complex language would be most advantageous, providing an immense survival benefit. Small, scattered populations trying to maintain connections across vast distances. Groups that needed to share detailed information about resources, dangers, and opportunities with precision. Individuals whose survival depended on their ability to learn complex skills quickly and teach them effectively to their children. Under these specific, intense conditions, any improvement in communication ability would provide massive, undeniable survival advantages. Individuals who could speak more clearly, understand more precisely, or convey information more effectively would be more likely to survive and reproduce, passing on those linguistic abilities. Over hundreds of generations, this relentless selection pressure would refine human communication abilities far beyond anything seen in other species, laying the groundwork for our unique linguistic capacities. By the time the three human species finally encountered each other again, modern humans meeting Neanderthals in the Middle East, Denisovans encountering both groups in Asia, they would have been capable of truly sophisticated verbal communication. They could share knowledge, negotiate alliances, perhaps even tell intricate stories about their ancestors who had survived the great dying 900,000 years before. But they were also starting to face new challenges. The world was filling up again. Resources that had been relatively abundant during the initial recovery period were becoming contested. and the three human species were beginning to compete directly for the same territories and the same precious resources. The age of unbridled cooperation was slowly ending. The age of direct, often brutal, competition was about to begin. Then came the meeting that would ultimately decide the fate of humanity. Around 60,000 years ago, the descendants of those African survivors, our direct ancestors, finally left their home continent in a major migration event. Not all of them, just a relatively small group, perhaps a few hundred individuals, who decided to cross the narrow waters between Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, venturing into the unknown. They had no idea, absolutely no inkling, that they were about to encounter their long-lost cousins, the other descendants of the bottleneck. For over 400,000 years, the three human species had been evolving in relative isolation. Modern humans, Homo sapiens in Africa, Neanderthals in Europe, and Denisovans in Asia, each had become perfectly adapted to their own specific environments. Each had developed their own unique technologies, their own distinct cultures, their own specialized ways of surviving. Now, they were about to meet face to face, a momentous occasion. The first encounter probably happened somewhere in the Middle East, perhaps along the eastern shores of the Mediterranean, where these African migrants would have encountered the southern edge of Neanderthal territory. Imagine that moment. You are a modern human, part of a small, pioneering band exploring new, unfamiliar lands. Your people have never seen other humans who look dramatically different from yourselves. Then suddenly, you spot them across a valley, moving with a powerful, deliberate gait. They're human, undeniably, but not quite like your people. Shorter and much more robust, stocky, with faces that project forward, massive brow ridges and enormous nasal openings. Bodies built like wrestlers, all dense muscle and thick bone, Neanderthals. Your first instinct might be fear or intense curiosity or perhaps even aggression. We will never know precisely what those initial meetings were truly like, what words, if any, were exchanged, or what emotions dominated. But we know what happened next because it's written, undeniably, in our DNA. They interbred. Modern humans and Neanderthals didn't just fight for territory, though there was certainly conflict. They formed relationships. They had children together. Genetic analysis shows multiple episodes of interbreeding over thousands of years, a complex story of both conflict and coexistence. Today, every person of non-African descent carries about 2% Neanderthal DNA in their genome. That's the clear genetic signature of those ancient encounters, proof that when our species met, at least sometimes, they chose cooperation and intimacy over pure conflict. But cooperation has its limits, especially when resources are scarce. The Middle East during this period was like a revolving door between species. Climate would shift, and modern humans would expand north, pushing into new territories. Climate would shift again, and Neanderthals, better adapted to the cold, would push back south, reclaiming their lands. For tens of thousands of years, the region changed hands repeatedly. Sometimes modern humans controlled the best hunting grounds and most reliable water sources. Sometimes Neanderthals did, but neither could establish permanent dominance until something fundamentally changed the rules of the game. Around 45,000 years ago, modern humans developed what archaeologists call the Upper Paleolithic Toolkit, a revolutionary set of technologies that made them far more effective hunters and gatherers. This included sophisticated spear throwers, called atlatls, that could launch projectiles with deadly accuracy and much greater force. Bone needles that allowed them to create finely fitted, insulated clothing for cold weather, a massive advantage. Fish hooks and nets that opened up entirely new aquatic food sources, diversifying their diet. Most importantly, they developed systematic blade production techniques for creating long, sharp cutting edges from small amounts of stone, maximizing their resources. These weren't just better tools. They were force multipliers, technologies that allowed smaller groups of humans to achieve what had previously required much larger groups. A Neanderthal hunting party might need 20 physically powerful people to take down a mammoth with thrusting spears. A modern human group, armed with spear throwers and coordinated tactics, could do it with 8. This efficiency advantage compounded over time. Modern humans could maintain larger territories with smaller populations. They could survive in marginal environments that would challenge even the robust Neanderthals. They could expand into new regions faster and establish permanent settlements more easily. The Neanderthals, who had survived the Ice Age through sheer physical toughness and close-knit group cooperation, suddenly found themselves outcompeted by a more technologically advanced and demographically expanding species. But they didn't go down without a fight. Archaeological evidence from this period shows increasing violence and territorial conflict between human groups. Neanderthal sites contain more weapons, and modern human sites show evidence of fortification. Skeletal remains from both species bear the clear marks of interpersonal conflict, suggesting direct confrontations. This wasn't necessarily genocide. It was brutal, existential competition for the same vital resources by two species that were just similar enough to want exactly the same things: water sources, prime hunting grounds, sheltered cave sites, and raw materials for tools. And increasingly, the modern humans were winning. Not because they were stronger. Neanderthals were physically superior in almost every way, more muscular, more robust. Not because they were necessarily smarter. Neanderthal brains were actually larger on average, suggesting similar cognitive capacities. They won because they were more flexible, more adaptable. Neanderthals had spent hundreds of thousands of years perfecting survival strategies for the specific, predictable conditions of Ice Age Europe. They were incredibly good at what they did, but what they did was very specific, very specialized. Modern humans, products of the African recovery period, where environments were constantly fluctuating and unpredictable, had been powerfully selected for adaptability, for behavioral flexibility. They could change tactics quickly when circumstances changed. They could exploit new, diverse food sources. They could modify their tools and techniques to handle unfamiliar challenges. When the climate shifted, and it shifted constantly during this tumultuous period, modern humans adapted with agility. Neanderthals, locked into successful but rigid survival strategies, struggled. Slowly, inexorably, Neanderthal populations began to shrink. First, they lost the prime territories, the rich river valleys, the abundant coastal areas, the best hunting grounds. Then they were pushed into more marginal regions, remote mountain valleys, dense northern forests, areas that modern humans didn't want yet or hadn't fully exploited. By 28,000 years ago, the last Neanderthals were living in southern Spain and Gibraltar, isolated populations clinging to existence in refuges that were shrinking every year. Then they were gone as a distinct species, absorbed or outcompeted. The story in Asia was different, but it followed similar patterns. Modern humans encountered Denisovans sometime around 50,000 years ago. We know even less about these specific meetings because Denisovan fossils are incredibly rare, making direct archaeological evidence almost non-existent. Most of what we know comes from the detailed genetic analysis of their DNA found in a single finger bone and a jawbone, and from their genetic legacy in modern populations. But the DNA tells a clear story. Like with Neanderthals, there was interbreeding. Modern Asian populations carry Denisovan genetic variants. Some Pacific Islander populations, particularly in Melanesia, have as much as 6% Denisovan ancestry, a significant genetic contribution. Unlike the European situation, there seems to have been less direct overt competition between modern humans and Denisovans in Asia, at least initially. The vast continent was large enough, diverse enough, that different groups could occupy different ecological niches for longer periods. Denisovans who had adapted to high altitudes continued living in the mountains. Those who had become seafaring specialists maintained control of island chains and coastal areas. Modern humans initially occupied different regions, river valleys, coastal plains, areas that complemented rather than directly competed with Denisovan territories. But eventually, the same technological and demographic pressures that had eliminated Neanderthals began affecting Denisovans too. Modern humans were simply more efficient at exploiting resources. They could support larger populations in the same territories, expanding their numbers. They could expand faster and establish new settlements more easily, outcompeting other groups over time. One by one, Denisovan populations were absorbed, outcompeted, or displaced. Some may have survived until surprisingly recently. There's tantalizing genetic evidence suggesting modern humans encountered Denisovans in Southeast Asia as late as 25,000 years ago. But eventually they too disappeared as distinct populations, their genetic legacy living on in us. By 20,000 years ago, Homo sapiens, modern humans, were the only human species left on Earth. The descendants of those 1,280 bottleneck survivors had outlasted their evolutionary cousins, who had also descended from the same ancestral population. The three-way split that had begun 800,000 years earlier was over. But why did modern humans succeed where Neanderthals and Denisovans failed? The answer brings us full circle, back to the bottleneck. Those 117,000 years of near extinction had selected for very specific, crucial traits in all three species: intelligence, cooperation, technological innovation, and adaptability. But the African population, the direct ancestors of modern humans, had faced one additional, unique challenge that their European and Asian cousins had largely avoided. Africa had remained climatically unstable, highly variable, even after the worst of the crisis ended. While Neanderthals adapted to the predictable, though harsh, patterns of Ice Age Europe, and Denisovans specialized for specific Asian environments, modern humans had to keep adapting to constantly changing, unpredictable conditions. Droughts that lasted decades followed by periods of devastating flooding, seasonal patterns that shifted every few generations, animal populations that appeared and disappeared unpredictably. This ongoing environmental pressure, this relentless variability, had kept modern humans evolutionarily flexible in ways that extreme specialization had not. When the three species finally encountered each other, Neanderthals and Denisovans were like finely tuned racing cars. Incredibly efficient and powerful under the right, specific conditions, but difficult to modify or adapt for new, unforeseen challenges. Modern humans were more like all-terrain vehicles, not as perfectly optimized for any single environment perhaps, but capable of handling whatever came next, whatever the world threw at them. This flexibility showed up in multiple crucial ways. Technology. Modern humans innovated constantly, developing new tools and techniques every few thousand years, a relentless pace of change. Neanderthals, by contrast, used essentially the same stone tool technology for over 200,000 years. It worked well for their environment, so they stuck with it, but lacked the rapid innovation. Social organization. Modern humans formed larger, more complex social networks, extending far beyond immediate family groups. They could mobilize more people for big hunts or territorial conflicts. They developed trade relationships that moved resources, information, and genes across hundreds of miles, creating vast interconnected webs of support. Demographics. Modern human populations could grow faster and recover more quickly from setbacks. When disease or climate disasters reduced a group's numbers, they bounced back within a few generations, maintaining their numbers. Diet: modern humans became extreme dietary generalists, eating everything from shellfish to mammoth meat to carefully processed plant foods, diversifying their food base. Neanderthals remained focused on large game hunting, an effective strategy but one that was vulnerable when climate changes affected prey populations. But perhaps most importantly, modern humans had developed more sophisticated communication abilities, refined during the bottleneck. The genetic bottleneck had created immense selection pressure for complex language in all three species, a necessity for survival. But modern humans, dealing with more variable environments and maintaining larger, more complex social networks, had pushed verbal communication the furthest. They could coordinate large group activities more effectively. They could share complex technical knowledge more accurately and efficiently. They could maintain relationships across greater distances and longer time periods, building resilience. When modern humans encountered Neanderthal or Denisovan groups, they weren't just competing for resources. They were competing with a communication and organizational advantage that had been 400,000 years in the making, honed to perfection. It wasn't a fair fight. By 15,000 years ago, modern humans had spread to every continent except Antarctica. They had developed agriculture, leading to permanent settlements and increasingly complex societies. The population that had once numbered only 1,280 individuals now included millions of people, speaking hundreds of diverse languages, shaping the world around them. They had inherited all the profound survival skills that had carried their ancestors through the bottleneck. But they had also developed something new, something their evolutionary cousins had never quite achieved. The ability to not just adapt to their environment, but to reshape it entirely, to bend it to their will. The age of human dominance had truly begun, and it all traced back profoundly to those desperate millennia when survival hung by the thinnest possible thread, when an entire species was on the brink. And somehow, impossibly, 1,280 individuals refused to give up, refused to vanish, carrying the torch of humanity forward. So here we are today, 8 billion humans. Everywhere you look, our species thrives. Tokyo has 14 million people in its metro area. Lagos has over 15 million. New York, London, Mumbai, Sao Paulo. Cities so massive they can be seen from space, glowing like intricate galaxies against the dark Earth at night. We've built the internet, connecting every corner of the planet, sharing information and ideas at light speed. We've mapped the human genome, unlocking the secrets of our own biology. We've sent robots to Mars and telescopes to the very edge of the universe, probing the cosmos. We've created art that moves people to tears and music that makes strangers dance together in joy. We are, without a doubt, the most successful species in the history of life on Earth. And every single one of us, every person reading this, every child being born right now, every human who has ever lived, carries the genetic signature of those 1,280 individuals who refused to give up 900,000 years ago. That's the part that truly stops you cold when you really, deeply think about it. Your DNA contains sequences, tiny segments of code, that survived the worst climate disaster our lineage ever faced. Genes that were tested by 117,000 years of near extinction, forged in that crucible and came through, resilient and strong. Chromosomes that fused under impossible pressure and somehow, miraculously, made us stronger, more capable. The way your brain works, the way you solve complex problems, the way you cooperate with strangers, the way you learn language, the way you care deeply for your children, all of it was shaped, honed, and refined by those desperate millennia when survival required every single advantage imaginable. You are walking, breathing proof that sometimes, against all odds, life finds a way to not just persist, but but to flourish. But this incredible discovery, this understanding of our past, means more than just a cool origin story. It explains so much about why humans are the way we are, why we possess these unique traits. Ever wonder why we're so much better at cooperation than other primates? Why we can work together in groups of hundreds or thousands, building intricate societies, while even intelligent chimpanzees max out at maybe 50 individuals in their social groups? It's because our ancestors spent over 100,000 years in populations so small, so fragile, that cooperation wasn't just useful. It was the only way anyone survived. Individuals who couldn't get along with others, who were selfish or aggressive, died out. Individuals who could share, teach, and work together lived long enough to pass on their genes, ensuring their traits continued. For 4,000 generations, natural selection was relentlessly fine-tuning our inherent capacity for collaboration, making it a cornerstone of our species. Ever wonder why humans are so utterly obsessed with teaching? Why we dedicate years of our lives just showing children how to do things that other animals learn through simple trial and error? It's because during the bottleneck, losing crucial knowledge when someone died could literally doom the entire group, erasing generations of accumulated wisdom. Our ancestors, who were best at transferring vital information, skills, and traditions to the next generation, had significantly better survival odds over those millennia. This created the powerful teaching instinct that lets human societies accumulate knowledge across countless generations, building upon the past. We didn't just survive the bottleneck. We became addicted to learning and sharing what we learned, creating culture. Ever wonder why we're so incredibly good with tools? Why humans can use everything from crude stone hammers to sophisticated smartphones, while even smart animals like dolphins only use tools in very limited basic ways? It's because tool making and tool use were literally life or death skills during the crisis years of the bottleneck. Individuals who could innovate, who could figure out better ways to get food, or make fire, or build shelter, were more likely to survive long enough to reproduce. We evolved into a species that sees the entire world as raw materials for solving problems, a species driven by innovation. But the bottleneck also explains some of our inherent weaknesses. Ever wonder why humans are so susceptible to infectious diseases compared to many other mammals? Why we get knocked out by viruses that barely affect other primates? Or why pandemics can sweep through our population so quickly? It's because we lost a staggering 65% of our genetic diversity during the bottleneck. That includes a lot of immune system variants that might have protected us from a wider range of pathogens. We're all much more genetically similar than we should be for a species our size, which makes us more vulnerable to diseases that can exploit common genetic weaknesses. Ever wonder why genetic disorders like sickle cell anemia or Huntington's disease persist in human populations when natural selection should have eliminated them? It's because some of these disorders might have provided a subtle advantage during the bottleneck period, or they might be unavoidable side effects of other crucial traits that were strongly selected for during the crisis. When you're down to 1,280 individuals, genetic quirks that would normally disappear can get locked into the entire species, becoming part of our common heritage. We carry the scars of near extinction, as well as the immense strengths. But perhaps the most profound implication of this discovery is what it tells us about human unity. Right now, in 2025, there are still people in the world who think that so-called racial differences between humans are meaningful in some deep biological sense. People who believe that populations that look different or speak different languages are fundamentally different types of humans. The bottleneck discovery absolutely obliterates that kind of outdated, harmful thinking completely. Everyone on Earth, literally every single human being, descends from the same incredibly small group of 1,280 individuals who lived 900,000 years ago. We've only been separated into different geographical populations for a few tens of thousands of years, which is nothing, an evolutionary blink of an eye in evolutionary terms. The genetic differences between any two human populations on Earth are smaller, sometimes dramatically smaller, than the differences you'd find within a single population of chimpanzees. We are all cousins, recent cousins, sharing an almost identical, profound origin story. When humans migrated out of Africa 60,000 years ago and spread around the world, they carried that bottleneck DNA to every continent. When they developed different skin colors and facial features to adapt to new climates and different environments, they were just expressing different combinations of the same underlying genetic toolkit, the same shared genes. The Aboriginal Australians who reached their continent 50,000 years ago, the Europeans whose ancestors survived the Ice Age, the Polynesians who navigated across the vast Pacific using stick charts and star maps, the Native Americans who crossed into the Americas during the last glacial period, all carrying genes from those 1,280 survivors, all products of the same evolutionary crucible forged by fire and ice. There is no them, there's only us, and us has always been one family, one profoundly interconnected species, shaped by the same shared history of survival against impossible odds. This has immense implications for how we think about modern challenges, too. Climate change, for instance. Right now, we're facing another period of rapid environmental transformation, driven by human activities. Not as severe as what our ancestors endured 900,000 years ago, perhaps, but serious enough to threaten human civilization and the ecosystems we depend on. The bottleneck discovery offers reasons for both deep concern and profound hope. Concern because past climate disasters have brought human populations to the very brink of extinction. We are not invulnerable. We are not guaranteed to survive just because we're clever or technologically advanced, but hope because we carry within us the genetic legacy of the ultimate survivors. The ancestors who made it through the bottleneck weren't just lucky. They were incredibly adaptable, fiercely innovative, and deeply cooperative. They were willing to completely change their way of life, to invent new solutions when circumstances demanded it. Those exact traits are still in us, waiting to be called upon. The same flexibility that let our ancestors survive the transition from lush forest to dry savanna to barren desert. The same profound cooperation that held tiny populations together through millennia of crisis. The same relentless problem-solving ability that developed new technologies when old approaches stopped working. We are not the same species that entered the bottleneck 930,000 years ago. We are the species that emerged from it, refined, tested, proven capable of surviving conditions that would kill almost any other large mammal on the planet. But survival isn't guaranteed. It never was. The brilliant researchers who discovered the bottleneck, Wang Zhu, Yuan Pan, Hipeng Li, and their dedicated teams, they've given us more than just an amazing scientific discovery. They've given us a mirror. When we look at the genetic evidence of those 117,000 years of near extinction, we're not just learning about the deep past. We're learning about ourselves, about our intrinsic nature. We are the species that doesn't give up, the species that finds ways to survive when survival seems impossible, the species that comes through disasters stronger and more capable than before. But we're also the species that can lose 99% of our population and spend over 100,000 years hanging on by our fingernails before things get better, a stark reminder of our fragility. The bottleneck is both a warning and a profound promise. A warning that human success is never guaranteed, that we've come closer to extinction than most people can possibly imagine. That our current dominance of the planet is not the inevitable result of being some chosen species, but the hard-won prize of ancestors who survived conditions that killed almost everything else, and a promise that we carry within our genes the deep-seated capacity to survive almost anything, to adapt, to innovate. That we are descended from 1,280 individuals who looked at a world falling apart around them, watched all other human groups vanish, and decided defiantly to keep going anyway. Every time you solve a problem, no matter how small, you're using skills refined during the bottleneck. Every time you cooperate with strangers to achieve a common goal, you're expressing behavioral patterns that kept tiny groups alive for millennia. Every time you teach a child something new, you're participating in the knowledge-sharing traditions that carried crucial information across 4,000 generations of crisis, ensuring humanity's future. The 1,280 live on in us, not metaphorically, not as a poetic idea, but literally in our chromosomes, our neural patterns, our inherent capacity for resilience and hope. 900,000 years ago, it truly looked like the human story was ending. The climate had turned hostile, unforgiving. Most human populations had died out, their legacies lost to time. A tiny group of survivors faced a world that seemed determined to kill them. They survived, they adapted, they multiplied, they spread across the planet and became us. Today, there are over 8 billion humans living on Earth. We've built cities that house millions, technologies that connect billions, art and music and literature that capture the full, complex range of human experience. We are the descendants of the 1,280. We are living proof that sometimes, when everything goes wrong, a few individuals can be tough enough, smart enough, and cooperative enough to keep hope alive until the world becomes livable again. And if our ancestors could survive that, could overcome such insurmountable odds, then we, their direct descendants, can surely survive anything. The bottleneck is over. The expansion continues. And the incredible story of those 1,280 survivors is now our story, an ongoing testament to the power of resilience and the unbreakable spirit of humanity.